Good morning, and welcome to another episode of The League of Biblical Enthusiasts. So last week we described the story of two twin spinster Presbyterian widows who were fabulously wealthy, discovered some very important early Syriac manuscripts of the New Testament in the Sinai desert, specifically in the monastery of St. Catherine. It's also referred to as the convent of St. Catherine by the Eastern Orthodox or Orthodox. Monastery typically is a Western term, but convent in Orthodox usage can refer to a religious housing that has either sexes, men or women. In this case, it is men who inhabit the monastery, although women are quite welcome, as you will see. Contrary to Mount Athos, which prohibits women. We discussed this in a previous episode. Anyway, back to the Sisters of Sinai. Their primary discovery became known as the Sinai Palimpsest, which turns out to be the oldest and most complete translation of the Gospels into any language, specifically in this case into Syriac. And FYI, and for your information, one significant reading of this Syriac Gospel is that it does not contain, as other early manuscripts also do not contain, the long ending of Mark chapter 16 and verses 9 and following. Anyway, be that as it may, today we begin the second of a three-series episode with further findings from the Sisters of Sinai, especially those in connection with their friend Solomon Schechter, that we'll speak of later. For much of the detail in this episode, I continue to rely on that wonderful biography of the sisters by Janice Soskis entitled The Sisters of Sinai, How Two Lady Adventurers Discovered the Hidden Gospels. I recommend it heartily to your reading. Although their work on finding and assisting in the transcription and translation of the Syriac Palimpsest was their most important discovery, there were other notable results to their credit. While at St. Catherine's in 1892, it was primarily Margaret's work, they cataloged the monastery's Syriac and Arabic manuscripts. They also found a tract of Plutarch, an edition also of 9th century Arabic copy of some letters of St. Paul. All of these and more, as their findings became transcribed and known, were published in 1894 by Cambridge University Press in 4 volumes entitled Studia Sinaitica. But there was still some unfinished business, however. Roughly 1/5 of the Syriac Palimpsest was not yet transcribed, and Agnes was determined to complete the job. This meant yet another trip to St. Catherine's, but there was a problem. A couple of years earlier, in 1893, the twins published a popular account of their discovery in a small book entitled How the Codex Was Found. Unfortunately, it contained some thoughtless remarks about the monks at the monastery. The monks were depicted as careless in their oversight of manuscript treasures in their possession. They were accused of neglecting their Christian duty to teach their Bedouin friends the scriptures. They wrote that despite 15 centuries of observing the liturgy and sacraments, quote, as for being a center of light to the population around it, the monastery might as well never have existed. And a final observation was made that the monks were, quote, sleepy, useless, and miserable during their Lenten fasts. Needless to say, Archbishop Porphyrios was deeply offended and refused permission for them to visit the monastery again. They were, of course, disappointed and saddened at this, but they resolved to make things right. So they set out from Cambridge early in 1895 in the hopes they could restore their relationship with the Archbishop. And on arriving in Cairo, they found the Archbishop wasn't there, but was in the Sinai desert. Father Nicodemus, who was still at Cairo, had the authority and allowed them to visit the monastery, but could not assure them that they would be received. But they proceeded in hope nonetheless. Oh, before they left Cairo, a shady antiquities dealer presented them with a beautiful 6th century Syriac copy of the Book of Maccabees. And it just happened to be the one that Rendell had photographed on his first trip to St. Catherine's. But when he returned on the trip with Agnes and Margaret in 1892, it was missing. So the sisters essentially recovered the stolen manuscript for the monastery. They informed the Cairo civil authorities, who arranged for it to be sent back to St. Catherine's. The Archbishop was ecstatic and praised their discovery, and this all made for a much better reception. They were received as honored guests. Agnes and Margaret presented the Archbishop with copies of their published catalogs and of the Syriac Gospels. He approved their work to complete the transcription. And Margaret wrote to Rendell that they were as happy as two little crickets. The Syriac Gospel Palimpsest was finally completely transcribed. But before returning home, they also visited Beirut and nearby villages where Syriac was still being spoken. Now, after returning to England, they expected to be busy transcribing the last portion of the Syriac Gospel and other manuscripts that they had purchased in Cairo. But plans changed when they received a letter telling of manuscripts leaking mysteriously onto the antiquities market in Cairo. So in early 1896, less than 9 months after returning from their last trip, they set out once more for Egypt. Their goal was to visit both Cairo and Jerusalem to photograph and purchase manuscripts that had recently come onto the open market. In fact, after their purchases from both cities, they left Jerusalem for their return home with some 2,000 manuscripts, mostly fragmentary, including Hebrew manuscripts. Meanwhile, Rendell and his wife were 800 miles away northward in Armenia, distributing to the distressed Christian population who were being persecuted at the hands of the Ottoman government. These were early days portending a dark future. The Armenian genocide was just 15 years away. But safely back home, the sisters were sorting through their new acquisitions. Margaret was studying the Hebrew texts and needed help in identifying some of them, so she turned to her Cambridge rabbinical friend scholar, Solomon Schechter. Schechter was the Cambridge reader in rabbinics, and while poring over their Hebrew manuscripts, he discovered they contained a fragment of the Hebrew scriptures known to Christians as Ecclesiasticus, and to Jews as the Wisdom of Ben Sirach, or Ben Sirach. This was one of 14 books included in the Greek Old Testament, the Apocrypha, but whose Hebrew originals were lost. Ben Sirach was largely dropped from the Hebrew usage, but remained in Christian usage until the 16th centuries, when the Reformers considered it and the other apocryphal books as non-canonical. Some scholars believe that the Greek apocryphal books never existed in a Hebrew original, but Schechter was convinced that Ben Sirach must have been written originally in Hebrew. Agnes wrote an article for 2 scholarly journals notifying them of the discovery, and within days, scholars at Oxford reported they had found another 9 leaves of the same manuscript among treasures recently brought back from Egypt. Schechter began to think there was something more going on than just coincidence, and thought perhaps someone in Cairo was dismantling a more complete copy of the Ben Sirach manuscript and feeding the leaves onto the open market. He suspected more. that even a horde of manuscripts was being gradually dumped onto the Cairo dealers and had a hunch where they were coming from. So he made plans to visit Cairo as soon as possible and revealed his intentions to only a few of his chosen friends. He invited Agnes and Margaret, but they could not make this trip because Agnes was sick from an illness and she was confined to her bed for several months. Schechter departed for Cairo in December 1896, just after the fall university term ended. He had with him a letter of introduction from the chief rabbi of London, Hermann Adler, which was addressed to the chief rabbi of Cairo, Aaron Raphael ben Shimon. And when Schechter arrived, he had no idea of what biblical treasures awaited him and how the Sisters of Sinai would play a part. He was eventually escorted to the oldest synagogue in Cairo, the Ben Ezra Synagogue. This is where the magic happened. And this we'll discuss in our next exciting chapter and our episode. I hope you've enjoyed what you've been hearing and learning, and if so, please like and subscribe and share with your friends. But be well and stay tuned for next week's episode featuring Solomon Schechter, the Sisters of Sinai, and their future in this episode of The League of Biblical Enthusiasts.